Imagine someone hands you a shovel, a torn piece of leather with a faded X drawn on it, and tells you it once belonged to the most feared pirate who ever lived. You'd start digging. Almost everyone would. For 300 years, people have been digging holes along the Carolina coast because of a man who died with his head nailed to the front of a ship. His name was Edward Teach. You know him as Blackbeard. And the treasure you've heard about, the one buried somewhere on a forgotten island, waiting for the right shovel and the right map? It almost certainly never existed at all. That should bother you. It bothers historians too. Here's the strange part. Blackbeard didn't need a map. He needed something far stranger. He needed a reputation. And reputations, it turns out, can be more valuable than gold. Let's go back to 1717. The man who would become Blackbeard was, at that point, just another sailor in a part of the world that had stopped making sense. The War of Spanish Succession had just ended, and with it, thousands of trained sailors lost their jobs overnight. Navies that once paid them shrank. Merchant ships barely needed crews. So they did what desperate, skilled men with nothing to lose have always done throughout history. They turned to piracy. Not because they dreamed of treasure chests, but because the alternative was starvation. Teach took command of a French slave ship, renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge, and outfitted it with 40 cannons. 40. For comparison, most pirate ships carried somewhere between 6 and 20. This wasn't a man hiding in the shadows of the sea. This was a floating fortress, and he wanted you to see it coming. Notice that. He wanted to be seen. Historian Colin Woodard, who spent years tracing primary documents from the so-called Golden Age of Piracy, found something the legends conveniently leave out. Blackbeard almost never fought. He didn't need to. He understood something that modern marketers spend careers trying to learn. Fear, properly staged, does the work that violence cannot. Picture him the way eyewitnesses described him. Long black beard, twisted into braids, tied with ribbons. Slow-burning fuses tucked under his hat, lit just before battle. So smoke curled up around his face like he'd crawled straight out of hell. He carried at least 3 pairs of pistols across his chest, along with knives and a cutlass. Merchant ships that saw him coming usually surrendered before a single shot was fired. Why fight a man who looks like that? This is the part of the story most people skip. Because it isn't the part with buried gold. It's the part with psychology. And it's the part that explains everything else. Ask yourself something. Why do you remember Blackbeard's beard, his pistols, his terrifying entrance, but you can't name a single specific thing he actually stole? You can't, because almost none of it survives in the historical record. What survives is the performance. Now here's where the story takes its strange turn. In November 1718, the British Royal Navy finally caught up with him near Ocracoke Inlet, off the coast of what's now North Carolina. Lieutenant Robert Maynard led the attack. The fight that followed was brutal. Hand to hand, blade against blade, and by most accounts, Blackbeard took 5 gunshot wounds and roughly 20 sword cuts before he finally died. Maynard had his head removed and hung from the bow of his ship as a warning to other pirates. The rest of his body, according to legend, was thrown overboard. Sailors who passed through that inlet for generations swore it swam in circles 3 times before sinking. That detail probably isn't true, but notice that people needed to tell it anyway. Notice how quickly a real, violent death turned into folklore. This is where the treasure myth was born, and it wasn't born from facts. It was born from absence. Here's the detail almost nobody knows. When investigators searched Blackbeard's known hideouts after his death, including Ocracoke and Bath, North Carolina, where he'd briefly settled and even received a pardon, they found almost nothing. No chest of gold, no hidden vault, A modest amount of cocoa, sugar, and everyday cargo, the kind any merchant ship might carry. That's it. So where did the legend of buried treasure come from? Psychologist and folklore researcher Jan Harold Brunvand, who studied how legends spread and mutate over generations, pointed out something important about stories like this one. Human memory doesn't tolerate unsatisfying endings. A famous, terrifying man dies suddenly, and the story just stops. No closure, no final secret. So the collective imagination fills the gap. It always has. It's the same instinct that turns disappearances into alien abductions and unexplained deaths into curses. The mind needs a reason, and if reality doesn't supply one, your imagination will manufacture one instead. The buried treasure wasn't history. It was a patch for a story that didn't end the way people needed it to end. And the timing matters here too. The treasure myth didn't really explode until more than a century later, when writers like Robert Louis Stevenson published Treasure Island in 1883. That book invented far more pirate tropes than most people realize. The treasure map with the X, the parrot on the shoulder. The phrase X marks the spot barely existed in real pirate history before fiction popularized it. Stevenson borrowed loosely from real pirate names, including Blackbeard's era, and fused them into a single unforgettable archetype. After that, the cultural memory of real pirates and fictional ones blurred completely. You inherited that blur, so did every person who's ever picked up a metal detector and walked the dunes of the Outer Banks hoping to get lucky. Here's the twist that should genuinely surprise you. Real pirates rarely buried treasure, because pirates rarely held on to money long enough to need to. Crews split plunder almost immediately after a successful raid. Money went to rum, gambling, prostitutes, repairs, and bribes to local officials who looked the other way. Why? Because pirate life was brutally short. Disease, violence, and the hangman's noose meant most pirates didn't expect to see middle age. Saving for a future you don't expect to have isn't rational. Spending immediately is. Burying a chest for some future version of yourself only makes sense if you believe that version is coming. Blackbeard, by most historical accounts, behaved exactly like this. He moved fast, spent fast, and left almost no physical fortune behind because there wasn't one to leave. So why do people still dig? This is where the story stops being about a pirate and starts being about you. Researcher and psychologist George Loewenstein, known for his work on the psychology of curiosity and uncertainty, found something worth sitting with. Uncertainty itself, not the reward at the end of it, is often what hooks the human brain the hardest. An unsolved mystery activates the same craving circuitry as a half-finished puzzle. It's not really about the gold. It's about the not knowing, the possibility, the itch. That's why treasure hunters still walk Ocracoke's beaches with metal detectors today, nearly 300 years after Blackbeard's death, even though the historical record all but confirms there's nothing there to find. It's not really about Blackbeard's fortune anymore. It's about the unfinished story he accidentally left behind. People aren't digging for gold. They're digging for an ending. And maybe that's the real reason this story still grabs you, centuries later. You don't actually want the treasure chest. You want the moment of certainty, the instant where the shovel hits metal and the not knowing finally stops. You chase that feeling more often than you realize. The unread message that might contain good news. The job application still pending. The unopened envelope. None of these are buried chests, but your brain treats them almost the same way. Lowenstein's research suggests that gap between what you know and what you want to know is one of the most powerful, least examined drivers of human behavior. Blackbeard didn't leave behind gold. He left behind a gap. And humans, it turns out, find gaps almost impossible to walk away from. So picture that shovel again. The torn map with the faded X. The man with the burning fuses in his beard, who understood better than almost anyone in his era that fear and mystery are currencies of their own. He never needed to bury treasure. He just needed you, 300 years later, still wondering where it is. Blackbeard may never have buried a fortune, but history is filled with people who risked everything for things far less glamorous than pirate gold. If this story surprised you, you'll probably enjoy my video, The Untold Story of the Medieval Smugglers, where we uncover the underground networks that secretly moved one of the most valuable commodities in Europe and the dangerous black markets that thrived in the shadows of medieval kingdoms. Click the video on your screen now and I'll see you there.